Thank you very much for joining us for this session on equitable practices through the eyes of the school counselor. One of the main threads of the message from the students this morning was the need for social emotional support. And so I'm very excited to welcome our speakers, Stephanie Miller-Henderson, Diana Mondragón, and Nilufar Rezai, and they'll introduce themselves so you get to know them a little better. And now I'll kick it over to you, Diana, to get us going.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for being here with us today. I believe, Nilo, can you just give me a head nod that you can see the screen? If you can. Okay, perfect. You're the one of the faces I see here, so I'm gonna count on you. Okay.
Just a slideshow on the right.
Oh, thank you.
At the top.
Oh, here we go. Okay.
So while Diana is getting us ready and sharing her screen, I know that Edith put a comment in the chat, but we want to know where you are checking in from. So thank you again for joining us for this session. If you could just tell us your where, what, and why. So where are you checking in from? What is your role? And why did you choose this workshop? All right. We have Evanston Township High School checking in. Welcome. Early College Coordinator, Rock Valley College. Awesome. We have our Executive Director from ISCA checking in. Welcome. We see some fellow school counselors checking in. Always excited to have our colleagues across the state. Thank you so much. Anybody, why do you choose this workshop? We know why some of the school counselors may have chosen it. They wanted to be here to support us. But why did you, especially if you're outside of the school counselor role, choose this workshop? All right, interested in how counselors work with students around next steps for college and careers. Perfect, we will definitely touch on that. SEL supports are essential. We concur with that for student growth. Awesome. All right, well, we are going to dive right in. Thank you so much for checking in with us in the chat. So I am Stephanie Miller-Henderson. I am a school counselor at Smith Elementary over in the University Village community in Chicago. I am in my 4th year as a school counselor, but my 10th year with Chicago Public Schools. I'm proud to lead several teams within my school building, but specifically the behavioral health team, as well as our social emotional learning team. And also proud members of the Illinois School Counselor Association, as well as the American School Counselor Association. And I do currently serve as our chair for the Illinois School Counselor Association's Race and Equity Steering Committee.
And hello again, my name is Diana Mondragón, or Diana Mondragón. I use she, her, pronouns, and I am in my 6th year as a school counselor at Dundee-Crown High School. It's where I have worked since graduating from my program from Northern Illinois University. So I was very grateful to have a job offer right out of grad school, and I've been here since. So I work mostly with our English learner population. I'm one of 2 ESL counselors. So I serve our English learners and their families, involved with different groups at the school here on the building level as well, and have mixed experiences with ISCA as well as the Illinois Association for College Admissions Counseling.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Nilufar Rezai. Thank you to the Illinois Education and Career Success Network organizers for inviting us to present today. I'm honored to be co-presenting alongside my esteemed colleagues, Stephanie and Diana. I've also been at Chicago Public Schools in a variety of roles over the past 10 years, but 6 of those have been spent working as a school counselor serving Latino and Black communities in Chicago. I've always been a member of the Illinois School Counseling Association, presenting at conferences throughout the years. But in the last 2 years, I've had the bounty of serving in leadership positions with ISCA to ensure that racial equity lies at the heart of everything we do statewide.
Okay, so just to touch on briefly about our purpose for today, as well as our goals and objectives. Our title of our presentation is called 2020 Vision. I'm sure there's so many of us that are just kind of done hearing 2020, but it is still how we describe great vision, right? In the world of, what would that be? Optometrics, maybe. So we want to talk a little bit about what school counselors have been working with since the pandemic, things that we have been noticing in the different domains that we work with or work in, as well as give some suggestions and tools for equitable practices, tying it back to the theme of this conference, which is Equity First, Building Toward a Better Future and Revitalizing Learning. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the current work that ISCA is doing, especially with the Race and Equity Steering Committee. And we'll talk about how equity is reflected in the different domains that school counselors work in. And we're hoping that you will be able to walk away as well with some tools and takeaways for how to implement equitable practices in schools.
I want to give a disclaimer that I believe that all 3 of us are currently in our school buildings. So bear with us if you hear, I'm in between passing periods, so you may hear a lot of background noise. I just want to throw that out there. But the Illinois School Counselor Association Race and Equity Steering Committee is extremely important. I feel it's kind of like a focal point for what we are going to elaborate on today. The development of the committee started in this year of the pandemic, 2020. And during that year, and I always kind of point out that I believe the Illinois School Counselor Association was spearheading this work even before the American School Counselor Association was kind of wrapping their arms around it. But the Race and Equity credential is a credential that was piloted in the spring of 2021. And so we fully launched that credential, which is about 30 hours of just like deep history, not just around the plight of African-American, but also our Latino populations, and just kind of taking a deep dive into just history, and then of course the practices that we as school counselors have to make sure are embedded in our school buildings for this whole idea of equity to even surface. So we are super excited that we are now actually currently in the midst of our spring credential that started, I believe, last Friday. So we are looking forward to kind of expanding our reach, if you will, across the state as we roll out this train the trainer model, where school counselors and of course school counselor educators will have the opportunity to train all of the staff within their school buildings beginning in school year 23 with this race and equity credential. So we are just super, super excited to be able to launch this initiative and hopefully definitely increase the awareness around race and equitable practices throughout our state.
All right, so just to give you a quick overview, school counselors provide individual, group, and classroom interventions in 3 interrelated domains: the academic, social, emotional, and college career development areas. We take a preventative whole child approach to ensure that the developmental needs of students are met in a comprehensive way. And today I will discuss the academic domain, Stephanie will present on the social emotional, and Diana will take us through the college and career domain. Next slide, please. So the American School Counseling Association, or ASCA, is our mother organization, which created a national model or framework that American school counselors use to implement their programs systematically and with fidelity. And to guide our work, ASCA has written dozens of position statements on a variety of topics, which are linked in this presentation, which we hope everybody will get a copy of. And to kick off our presentation today, this excerpt is from the Equity for All Students statement. School counselors recognize and distinguish individual and group differences and strive to value all students and groups equally. School counselors promote the equitable treatment of all students in school and the community. Next slide. So also from the position statement on academic development, counselors are taught to use and collect data to understand student needs, to implement closing the gap interventions, and remove systemic barriers to ensure all students as early as preschool and kindergarten have the opportunity to develop academic goals at all grade levels, reflecting their abilities and academic interests, and can access appropriate, rigorous, relevant coursework and experiences. So that's to kick us off. Next slide, please. So today I will speak about the achievement, opportunity, and funding gaps that I saw in my school and district since the pandemic. This is, as I mentioned, my 6th year as a counselor in Chicago Public Schools, but my 2nd year in my current school. And I was hired during the pandemic when scholars were engaged in remote learning. Even though my district responded to the technology and Wi-Fi gap of our Black and Brown communities by providing free Chromebooks and internet so students could engage in remote learning, those tools weren't without their problems when connectivity issues or loss and breakage of devices occurred. Chicago Public Schools also provided childcare at 6 Learning Hub sites to families who work full-time and qualified. But for those who didn't qualify, however, some students were left to care for younger siblings at the same time that they were logging into their own classes. And some of those students whose parents were unemployed would take students out of class in the middle of the school day to run errands or visit relatives. And even when there weren't those obstacles, most students had their cameras off and participated minimally, resulting in incomplete classroom assignments, especially in the middle grades. On the other hand, wealthier families in our district had technology already, could afford at-home childcare, had the resources to troubleshoot tech or childcare problems when they came up. One of the opportunity gaps I saw during the pandemic was the lack of supplemental tutoring and academic support for Black and Brown students in remote learning. Students who fell behind or weren't adjusting well to remote learning didn't have the privilege of private tutors, after school or park district programming, or homeschooling like their wealthier peers on the North Side. All that to say, when scholars from my school returned in person, not only did they face a school readiness gap by having to learn how to adjust to peers, the curriculum, and an increasingly paperless environment, but they also had to work through the ongoing traumas they experienced from healthcare disparities, COVID safety protocols, the uncertainties of shifting back to remote when quarantined, and the ongoing feelings of anxiety, sadness, or loss that ensued from these disruptions. For example, in the last week of hybrid learning, one of our 8th graders was killed on their front porch when they had stepped outside to greet a family member who stopped by during the school day to visit. This tragedy ended up being the impetus for one of the equitable practices I'll share on the next slide. Finally, in looking at achievement data and drilling down to root cause, we found a deficit in executive functioning skills, in particular within our middle school population. Next slide. In order for students to readjust to interacting with peers, they needed emotion control and response inhibition. In order to adjust to the paperless environment, they needed flexibility, goal-directed persistence, and sustained attention. In order to readjust to their curriculum, they needed task initiation, planning, and time management. Executive functioning skills were already a challenge pre-pandemic and became that much more heightened once students returned to in-person instruction. Next slide, please. So given these gaps in academic supports, here are the equitable practices I consistently uphold to ensure students set academic goals that are authentic and met by rigorous and relevant coursework and experiences. Success Bound is a curriculum I implement once a week with my 6th to 8th graders, which provides academic, career, and social emotional lessons. I modify the content to ensure that the learning materials and resources are culturally responsive and reflect the exclusively Black population I serve. Throughout each lesson, I incorporate videos, stories, or songs that are Afrocentric so that students regularly see examples of Black genius, creativity, and beauty. When relevant, I discuss how anti-Black racism has harmed and oppressed entire populations while highlighting how white supremacy and inequitable learning opportunities continue to plague individuals, institutions, and communities. In addition to supporting students, I have also worked with families to listen to their stories and acknowledge their needs. In response to surveys and conversations with them, I curated a pool of community resources that I continually update and post on our website. Another equitable practice I engage in is directly tied to my life's purpose of dismantling anti-Black racism at personal, professional, and institutional levels. I reflect daily on my impact and worldview vis-a-vis the students and communities I serve. As Dr. Ibrahim Kendi advised us, I strive to uncover, name, sit with, and talk about my biases. An example of how I do this in the classroom is by resisting the temptation to judge students' behavior against a European worldview, and instead take cues from students about how they learn. Dr. Nichols' axiology framework helped me understand how I walk through the world, and that's linked in the end of our slides for you to see. For example, when I'm teaching a lesson to my 8th graders and they are chatty, instead of expecting absolute silence, I realize that learning is emotional and connecting allows for greater understanding and application of what they are learning. So I use attention getters, explain what the goals and tasks are briefly, and then play music while encouraging students to increase their stamina throughout the lesson. That being said, I hold high expectations for my students by frequently reminding them that I expect excellence for and from my scholars. I explain that they should not do the minimum to get by on assignments, nor only reach for easy topics or options when working on assignments or applying to schools, high schools, for instance. Another way that I challenge the European worldview is when it comes to the concept of time and task versus relationship. If students need more time because they are talking while they are working, then I give them that. If students lose focus in the larger group when completing an assignment, I will pull them later in small groups or one-on-one settings to give them time to complete their work while we talk about what they like or don't like about the class. All this goes back to the fact that students learn best from those they like. When students see you are authentic, vulnerable, and honest, when they see you care about who they are and value their contributions, when they see you recognize their power, they will do the work. The more genuine you are, the more they will live up to your expectations. The last equitable practice I use to promote academic success is by providing access to student leadership opportunities. By eliminating the philosophy that the person standing in front of the room is the keeper of all knowledge, I enable students to become co-creators of their learning space. Asking my students to co-teach lessons, recognize classmates who exemplify positive behavior, buddy up with others who need extra help, or make decisions about what music to play or what time to set to complete a task are ways that I ensure my students feel seen, heard, and understood so they can learn. Instilling a sense of service and community-oriented thinking is another way that I help build students' capacity. To this end, colleagues and I developed 4 student leadership groups this year. Although all of the groups focus on how to help their feelers follow expectations and the school-wide caring theme, one in particular, the Anti-Violence Youth Committee, it was created in response to the student who died last year from gun violence. The Anti-Violence Youth Committee is giving back to their North Lawndale neighborhood by collaborating with community organizations, the aldermen, and the Chicago Police Department to activate a healing space that includes a monument and community garden honoring the lives of young people lost to gun violence in North Lawndale in recent history. Through this initiative, students are confronting, naming, and actively dismantling a system of poverty and destruction that marginalizes the residents of North Lawndale. This type of leadership initiative is part of a healing-centered engagement model, which moves away from focusing only on the harm, injury, and trauma the individual went through, which is deficit-based model, to one where the root cause or environmental context that caused the harm in the first place is transformed. This is an asset-driven, holistic approach that involves culture, spirituality, civic action, and collective healing. Next slide, please. In summary, I leave you with some tools and calls to action to close the financial, opportunity, and achievement gaps. Engage students in culturally responsive lessons that build their executive functioning skills while being mindful of how you impact others and walk in the world. Linked here is a comprehensive unit on executive functioning, complete with lesson plans, materials, rubrics, and infographics. I encourage you to modify and adopt it to the population you are serving. In addition to understanding your own biases and impact on students, make every effort to get to know the population you serve. Linked here is a sample needs assessment I give to all my 3rd to 8th graders every year, along with a learning profile. I ask students who are in my small groups or one-on-one sessions to complete this so I can really get to know them. Furthermore, engaging students in leadership opportunities and regular self-reflection on their own academic progress are keys to building their knowledge, skills, and capacity. Finally, to reduce the financial gap, provide families with access to resources in the community that will address their hierarchy of needs is a must. Linked here is what I shared with families in response to their needs assessment and continue to update throughout the year. Thank you. So now in the chat, we'd like all of you to just quickly type in one thing that was new, one thing you already knew, and one thing you think you'll do as a result of hearing more about the academic domain. And we'll give you a couple of minutes.
All right, while we're waiting for those new, and do responses in the chat, Nilu, I could definitely share one thing that that I will do is be more intentional around those executive functioning needs of the students, especially because I noticed that same trend in my building with our middle school students as well. So thank you for that. Love the idea of recognizing students' need to process information and side conversations and not looking at behavior through a Western European view. Awesome. I think this is Susie, maybe, knew we saw the exact same data reflected with our students during the height of the pandemic. And then what is new, executive functioning skills. Susie and I are seeing eye to eye. Love this. And yes, I can see how this can be used. Matthew knew the roles. The resources are new, and then Matthew plans to review the resources and share. Awesome, thank you. All right, we are going to move right along. Thank you so much for those responses. We are going to take it to, I feel like the social emotional learning component is like the glue. It's in between both the academic and the college and career domain. But nevertheless, they are all intertwined. So this too is taken from the American School Counselor Association's position statement on social emotional development. And it reads, school counselors serve as a first line of defense in identifying and addressing student social and emotional needs within the school setting. School counselors have unique training in helping students with social emotional issues that may become barriers to academic success. That means we've been in school for a long time. That's what the unique training piece means. Within the context of a school counseling program, school counselors develop school counseling curriculum, deliver small group counseling, and provide appraisal and advisement directed at improving students' social emotional well-being. And we have these position statements linked into the slides as well. So what I am seeing, I talked about some things kind of externally in the field of social emotional learning in general, and then kind of brought it into the school building. So social emotional learning, as many of you on this in this conference probably already know, kind of found the foundation of it and the development was from the collaborative of academic and social emotional learning, which is CASEL in 1994. So that's almost 30 years ago, where we get those 5 core competencies around SEL. What I've noticed is a cycle, what I call a cycle of reactionary implementation. So, you know, as a human race, we're often responding to incidents as opposed to proactively planning around those incidents that we know are probably going to surface. So I often state that COVID-19 during 2020, during the pandemic, didn't necessarily allow new issues to surface, as I think Nilu kind of alluded to during the academic piece, but what it did was serve as a magnifying glass to issues that we already knew existed. So it kind of brought out those inequities just a little bit more, if you will, so that they were more noticeable during the pandemic than they were, or at least people pay more attention to them, shall I say. So I've also noticed this multifaceted approach to the way that the teachers and staff deliver Tier 1 SEL curriculum. So Tier 1, of course, is that thing, if you will, that all students receive. So every student in your building or every young person within your organization or whatever capacity that you serve will be getting the same thing. So that's the Tier 1 component. I've noticed that a lot of organizations or companies that have SEL services have increased the way in which they or have become more unique and creative in the way that they deliver those. So we have a lot of online support, a lot of electronic curriculums, if you will, where students can move through modules on their devices, whether from their phones or from their Chromebooks or whatever have you. And also just making sure certain populations are focused on the way that the curriculum presents their characters, even, if you will. So making sure that representation is there and whomever is reading throughout the curriculum, or whatever characters that they use to help students to kind of walk through those different tools. I'm thinking of one curriculum in particular that we will talk about in the next couple of slides, where the characters look like the students, right? So that's exactly what we're talking about when we talk about this multifaceted approach. So another thing that I've been noticing is a lot of advocacy around the way that we actually deliver social and emotional learning. So breaking down those barriers, the systemic ways that we often did things. Again, Nilu alluded to us moving away from that Western or European approach, and just making sure that, because that's really the only way that we can deliver equitable practices, right? If we make sure that we're including every child, every student, no matter their ethnic background, no matter their socioeconomic status. So this is exactly what I've been seeing, a lot of advocacy around that in the media, with different funding opportunities that have been coming through the pipeline for states and then hitting the school districts. So I'm really excited about that component. But I've also noticed a need for implementation that kind of goes across disciplines, if you will. So across educational settings and content areas. So there is a real need for teachers to be able to learn how to implement SEL when they're teaching math, or implement SEL when they're teaching reading or ELA. And so just, I feel that there is a need for more, I guess, training or professional development, if you will, around ways that teachers could do that. But that also kind of looks like having school counselors involved in the selection of curriculum, right? That's one way that we can make sure that this visibility of SEL in all educational settings actually occurs. And then lastly, I'm seeing a need for mandatory race and equity training. So we brought up the Illinois School Counselor Association's race and equity credential. So, that's just an example of a way that we can ensure that school counselors and other educators are receiving the tools that they need, but also creating that space for educators to be able to check their own biases, right? To be able to recognize when they're sending or we're sending micro messages to students as it relates to their ability to adapt to whatever that setting is. All of that, the way that we build community as educators, definitely impacts a student's social and emotional growth. We can go to the next slide. So I wanted to just show a little correlation between the CASEL foundation of SEL, so bringing out those 5 core competencies of students' relationship skills, responsible decision-making, self-awareness, self-management, and social awareness. And then also taking a look at it in our city of Chicago, the integration of schools didn't occur to almost 30 years before that happened. So we're working within a small window when we think about equitable practices across our major city, within the state of Illinois. So that's something important for us to consider. And then also, I talked about the representation of all students in that Tier 1 SEL curriculum and instruction. So I like how, and these are tools that I've used, and one in particular that I will be using this school year, but EverFi is one of those, kind of talks about the multifaceted approach. So it's a Tier 1 online company, if you will, that tackles SEL in almost all of those 5 core competencies. And one set of lessons in particular is called 306, Continuing the Story. And so these lessons actually focus on African American history. And it talks about the significance of the number 306 even. One being that is the room number that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was staying in at the hotel when he was assassinated. So just even the way that they titled the lesson made sure that it had a focal point around African American history. And then Celebrating Strengths of Black Youth, CSBY. This is a Tier 2 small group that myself and my dean are gearing up to facilitate. And it specifically focuses on the self-worth, building self-esteem with Black youth in ages around 9 to 11. So I always say our 3rd through 5th graders are like the middle child. I always feel like, we either focus on the primary students or we focus on the middle school students. And sometimes that the middle child is kind of left out. So I feel like CSBY understood that. And so they're helping us to be able to focus on culture, focus on heritage, and to be able to have our Black youth have that sense of pride, which is adverse to what mainstream society or mainstream media actually tells them. Both of these, EverFi I've used, and I see some EverFi love in the chat, I think. I've used since my first year as a counselor, one, because it's free. We didn't get any special funding around SEL tools during my first year as a counselor. So I was always looking for free resources. So this idea or this teaching method, if you will, of counter storytelling is what I see in both of these tools. Counter storytelling is just that interrupting of the story that's been told by people that never went through the actual event, right? So for example, it's just the idea of allowing people to tell their own stories. So if you have stories of marginalized people, actually allowing those people to tell the story. And so at the very beginning of the 306 lesson, you hear this explanation of counter storytelling, which I think is very, very crucial when we talk about equitable practices in SEL. So tools and call to action. And many of you are probably aware of Chimamanda's Danger of a Single Story. It's about 12 years or so old, but it is a phenomenal TED Talk that talks about her, if you will, having pity for someone from a cultural background before she even knew their individual story. So having the assumption of, I think she talks about even her trip to Mexico and how she carried that with her even there. And then how she in turn encountered that same thing when she had a roommate that assumed that she couldn't speak English or assumed that, she only came from, this particular neighborhood or community, if you will, in her country. And that's kind of the same thing that our students face when they come into the doors a lot of times of our school buildings. There is this assumption that here you are, my poor child, my poor Black youth who comes from this violent single parent or poverty-stricken household. Those are often the assumptions that many educators have, and this is through, I can only speak for the space that I'm in, but you know, those messages or those biases actually come through when we're teaching or when we're caring or attempting to build community. So we have to keep that at the forefront when we think about social and emotional learning. So how are you re-traumatizing your students, if you will? And how is that impacting their social and emotional growth? We talked about, Nilu alluded to the grief from gun violence that her student had to endure. So when the student enters the school building, how are we supporting that student? Are we assuming that the student is numb because they live in a community where the gun violence occurs frequently, that maybe they're used to it and maybe we don't need to provide the supports? So those are kind of the dangers that educators can have and kind of further, I want to say, impede the growth of our students. I specifically linked or brought up a title from an article that I read, or not the title, if you will, but the location where this educator was from. But I was thinking about an article that I read of a teacher who stopped her lesson to, I want to use the word grill, for lack of a better word, but grill her 7th grade African-American student for having on a shirt that said Black King. The shirt had the continent of Africa on it, and above it, it said Black King. And he had gotten this t-shirt as a gift from his mother. So as opposed to embracing that, talked about the curriculum that I'll be using, CSBY, as opposed to using that as an opportunity to help to boost her students' esteem. This teacher literally stopped her lesson to tear that student down. And she went on to say, what if I had on a t-shirt that said White Queen? And maybe this month should be White History Month. And so the conversation kind of went along those lines. So can you imagine the emotional trauma, if you will, that this student is embarrassed, I'm sure, probably doesn't really know what to say or how to confront this. Of course, the parent was involved, and this student, I mean, this educator was, you know, some disciplinary things occurred, but this is definitely along the lines of my example of re-traumatizing young people when they come into our school buildings. So there is a need to understand that social and emotional learning and mental well-being begins with what we tell ourselves as educators and then what we tell our students. So there is a need for us to keep self-efficacy at the forefront. How are we empowering our students through social and emotional learning? How are we allowing their individuality, their uniqueness to shine, if you will, and kind of creating real community for students by letting them just know that they belong, right? And that they have everything that it takes in order to succeed. So those are definitely some pressing calls to action that I wanted to share today. One thing that is very crucial when it comes when we talk about advocacy, if you will, around social and emotional learning, building this time into the master schedules across our school districts. That's the first line of defense. That's foundational, because if we do that, then we no longer leave room to assume, well, the teachers are doing it or the counselor is doing it. Usually they're, you know, I'm not going to say usually, I don't have the percentages, the data in front of me, but we know that our state overall has not met the counselor to student ratio of 250-1. So we can't assume that the school counselor is able to reach every student in their building to do that social and emotional learning piece. Remember, the goal is that every student receives it on a tier 1 level. So in order for that to really truly occur, we have to make sure that we build the time into our schedules. So 20 minutes, 25 minutes, enough time for teachers to actually utilize an evidence-based curriculum whether it's going to be, on paper, or whether it'll be something that students can work through on their Chromebooks, if you will, but just making sure that time is built in, that we're able to implement SEL with fidelity. And then creating a space for student voice. So how do we engage our students in the building? Have we identified student leaders that can say what it is that they feel that they need? We recently administered an SEL skills inventory in our building in December, and the students, the self-reported inventory that they took mirrored exactly what we've been seeing. It mirrored exactly what their teachers were seeing post this pandemic, or we're still, recovering from this pandemic, if you will. So the students were honest. Their voice can be trusted. So that's one thing that I definitely want to call us to. And then definitely the utilization of curriculum across the core subjects. So kind of talked about that early on, of how do we bring up SEL when it's not SEL time, right? How do we, if we're talking about a particular novel, how do we point out the social and emotional learning or attributes or qualities that the characters are portraying? And so those are definitely, again, I think this closes out the tools and a call to action portion for SEL. All right, now some more fun. Tell us something that you knew already. No, I'm sorry, something that's new, brand new, then something that you knew, and one thing that you'll do.
Well, we're getting some some responses in the chat, Stephanie. I just want to, as I'm hearing this, there's just, and my mind goes to systems, right? Like there's so many things that our students need with regards to SEL, and yes, it'd be just amazing if we could have the time built into the school day. Let's say that happened, like you were saying, Stephanie, like who is leading that, who's doing it? So I think sometimes districts or state organizations or just people who maybe are making decisions have a good idea, but then push it off to other people to figure out how it's going to work. So I love that. I love creating systems for doing this with integrity and having a good plan to make sure that our students are being taken care of and have their SEL needs met, but also that the staff leading the SEL understand there's a buy-in, there's a culture, there's clarity, and they're ready to lead. Okay, well, thank you all for sharing in the chat. We are going to move right along since we have just a few minutes left. We have about 10 minutes left. Okay, so the final domain that school counselors work in is a college and career domain. And so in this domain, our goal is to help students understand the connection between school and the world of work, and then helping them make a plan for that successful transition. So just some opportunities that I've been seeing or noticing as far as for revitalizing, again, going back to the theme of this conference, is helping students with their competencies around career awareness and exploration. I think a lot of our students who maybe don't have as strong of a foundation for post-secondary planning, perhaps their families didn't go to school here or in home countries, hear a career, but then don't really understand what it's going to take. So I hear a lot of like, I'm interested in nursing, but I don't like science, or I'm interested in engineering, but I don't really like math. So like helping students really develop competencies about their options, aligning their options to their skills, to their interests, helping our students be employment ready, goal setting and awareness of different pathways. And then I also believe we need more professional development for school counselors for options that are the non-traditional college route. So as far as what I've been seeing, I found this article, I came across this article, I believe actually in one of our ISCA newsletters, and I'm obsessed with it. I've read it so many times, and every time I think, yes, this student has so many great ideas, and he's a student. So this was written by a student. I believe he is a high school senior in North Carolina. And the article is called, as you can see here, Listening to Students, the path forward for schools of tomorrow. So I took some of the quotes that most got me thinking and resonated with me, and I put them on this slide and the next slide as well. But one that and some of these quotes, it rings a bell of things that I've heard my students tell me. For example, the second one here, that grades aren't everything. And I think back to sometimes when my students are talking to me about, going to college and making plans, and I tell them, I don't really know where any of my colleagues went to college. I don't go around asking them how their college experience was, or like, I don't judge them about that. So I think our students are starting to understand that grades aren't everything. Where you go to school isn't everything. There's more to being a human, to being an adult in the world. And so I really love this quote: who you are as a person and developing a holistic approach to building social and emotional connections are so valuable to future success. And I find that to be very true. This second paragraph is something that really got me thinking, because I'm 32, right? So I was born in 1990, and like somewhere between that era or that decade, we just jumped into this age of information, and there's information at our hands available all the time. I remember when I was in fourth grade in 1999, and my fourth grade teacher told me one day, schools, there's going to be, instead of notebooks, every student's going to have a computer. And that's true. That's true. I am in a district right now that's 1-to-1. All our students have Chromebooks. I would say 95, if not more, % of our students have phones. And so school now is becoming, or it should be becoming, a place that is not necessarily just about information, because our students and the students that I work with, I hear all the time, oh, I Googled the answer. I Googled the geometry video, or I Googled, like, they need help connecting the dots. And so I really liked that quote here, that this is something that the student is advocating for. Is in a time that schools took advantage of the technology and advancements in research to find ways to meet us students where we are. So as far as what I'm seeing, there is so much information out there, and I think a lot of our students are getting lost in the info. They're constantly getting emails from different organizations, different schools, different opportunities, and it's a lot. It's a lot to navigate through. And I have been seeing more and more, there's this trend of sending out videos, and I think a lot of our students are connecting to that. It's something that they can just click. It's something that they're kind of going accustomed to doing, growing up in the age of social media. Videos are just there all the time. I've also been seeing that students might be graduating, but then they're not continuing with plans. Our students, and again, I work a lot, or I work mostly with our English learner population, and sadly, I never spent a lot of my time helping my students who are English learners apply straight to university. But I can say that within like the first 4 years-ish, I was writing letters of recommendation for university. I was doing the Common App. I've not done a single Common application in the last 2 years. I'm more and more helping my students apply for community college, which is fantastic because our community colleges have options, but I'm also noticing just how much they need help, like even just finding the application online, answering questions like intended start term. Our students need a lot of help that I think sometimes adults assume that they just have this, it's just common knowledge, or they know how to get this this information. Oh, and then seeking diversity on campus is also something that I have been hearing and seeing. So just real quick, I think some equitable practices is thinking instead of what's wrong with the students or what are their deficits, thinking about like how can we fix ourselves, how can we eliminate obstacles so that there's less of those in the way. Eliminating financial and tech gaps, as I know Nilu did mention about as well. Access to resources, including just more school support personnel. Again, like not every high school or every school has college and career counselors, and a lot of us are generalists while also trying to do post-secondary planning with our students. And I think also in addition to hiring college and career counselors, something that is new in my district this year is developing equity coaches, which actually they're now called inclusion coaches because we cannot use the word equity for some reason. But this person is someone like a literacy coach, someone who would help students with, or teachers help students with reading, or like a digital learning coach. So this would be a specific person who would help interested staff weave in equitable practices to their classrooms. And lastly, I believe there is investment in statewide professional development, as Stephanie mentioned, in social emotional learning, but also, as I had mentioned, other options besides the traditional college university route. For me, especially, I feel like I need training in HBCUs and other calls to action. And I know that sometimes there's just not, these issues are larger to tackle, but I do feel some of our graduation requirements are a little antiquated, and maybe there should be graduation requirements that have things like SEL, conflict resolution, team building, problem solving, career exploration. And then lastly, just revitalizing the role of the school counselor, making sure that the people who we are being tasked with guiding our students are provided with training, with resources, and with time to support students in developing a really important part of lifespan development. And with that, we have, I know, just barely time left here, but we do want to say thank you and share our information here. And as we had mentioned, we're hoping that this presentation will be available and accessible to all the participants. We have lots of great tools and resources linked in here for you. But if there's any questions, feel free to unmute or put in the chat in the last 2 minutes that we have here.
Well, thank you so much, Diana, Nilufar, and Stephanie. That was a really informative session. I love the call to action. Nilufar, your comment about being authentic and honest enables students to live up to our expectations. Thank you for that reminder. And Stephanie, the idea of counter storytelling, I think, is really powerful. And Diana, I think your suggestion about helping students align their skills and interests is critical for career pathways. So thank you all very much. And thanks to the participants for your active engagement. That's always a sign that this was a great session. And everything has been recorded, and you will be receiving this via email with all the resources, and it'll also be on our website. And please remember to complete the feedback surveys so that we can see how we did with this session. Thanks everyone, and we'll see you in the next session.